Hey folks, in 1995, a taxi driver dropped a 16-year-old girl off on a bridleway in the middle of the North Downs on a wet November evening. And as he pulled away, he glanced back at her. She wasn't walking. Instead, she was just standing there in the rain, not moving, and not heading off in any direction at all. That was the last time anyone is known to have seen Ruth Wilson, and that was over 30 years ago now. Almost everything Ruth did on the 27th of November 1995 looks deliberate. It doesn't look panicked or chaotic, yet after 3 decades, more than 1,000 acres of searching, helicopters, dogs, thermal imaging, and a police operation that is still technically open, nobody can tell you what she was planning. So, let's go through that Monday. Before I do though, it's worth being upfront about where a lot of this comes from. Much of what we know about Ruth's final day traces back to reporting by the journalist Martin Bright, who covered the case for The Observer in 2002, drawing on interviews with Ruth's family and other people around her. It gives us enough to lay out where she went and roughly when. What it doesn't give us, and what nobody has ever really been able to give us, is a way inside her head. That's important to keep in mind as we go through this. Ruth was 16, with a family, friends, commitments, and a future that we never got to see. As of right now, the charity Missing People still lists her from missing from Betchworth. That's where Ruth lived, a small village near Dorking in Surrey, with her father Ian, her stepmother Karen, and her younger sister Jenny. She had not long started 6th form, and by all accounts was really bright, and had a weekend job at a local music shop. From everything that people have said about her since, she had a full life and a settled routine that seemed to suit her. And I think that's important to say early, because nobody who actually knew her has ever described someone who had checked out, so to speak, or anything like that. So, to that Monday morning, the first slightly odd thing is that Ruth didn't get on the school bus with her sister Jenny. Jenny later made the point that this wasn't completely unheard of, as Ruth was a 6th former by this stage, and her days did vary, so on its own it wouldn't have set off any alarm bells. The thing is, she never went in that day at all, and that only became significant once she hadn't come home. Shortly after Jenny had left, Ruth's friend and former boyfriend, Will, came by in his car and offered her a lift. She turned him down and told him that she'd see him later. She never did make it to school, and it seems she'd already covered for that by claiming she had a study period, which is exactly the sort of thing that would stop people from chasing it up for a good few hours. After that, the trail is at least a bit clearer for a while. She took a taxi into Dorking and settled into a library for most of the afternoon. Somewhere in that time, she stopped at a florist and arranged a bouquet of flowers for Karen, with the oddly specific instruction that it shouldn't arrive until Wednesday, 2 days after the current day that we're talking about. Then, late in the afternoon, she picked up a second taxi from the station and gave the driver a single destination, Box Hill. The flowers are one of those details people have gone round and round on ever since, and honestly, you can read them 2 completely different ways, and both would be perfectly reasonable. On the one hand, it could have been a quietly lovely gesture for the woman who raised her, arranged without a card because Ruth didn't want any fuss. On the other hand, it could have been a goodbye set on a timer, meant to arrive once she was already gone. Her friend, Catherine Mayer, later read the gift as pointed rather than affectionate. Ruth's family didn't accept that reading at all. And the honest truth is, neither version can be proven, so I'm not going to pretend one of them is obviously right. The library is much the same. Ruth was in there for several hours, but nobody has ever been able to say what she was actually doing. Maybe she was getting ready for something. Maybe she was waiting to meet somebody, or maybe she was just somewhere warm and familiar with the time to think. You can build a story around any one of those, but that doesn't make it the answer. It's the combination of everything that day that makes it stand out. Not going to school, moving about on her own, spending hours away from home, arranging a flower delivery for 2 days later, and then ending up out at Box Hill in the late afternoon. Taken as a whole, it does look purposeful, but purposeful and understood are 2 different things. And it's the gap between those 2 things that this whole case seems to live in. and by the time that second taxi pulled out of Dorking, the landscape itself starts to become part of the story. Box Hill is a National Trust beauty spot on the North Downs, rising to about 224 metres, or somewhere around 375 feet, and it's covered in footpaths, viewpoints and bridleways. The ground can change on you quickly once it's dark or wet. It's walked constantly all year round, so it isn't remote wilderness in the way people might picture when they think about such hilly terrain. And that becomes fairly important later on. Her taxi stopped close to a bridleway near a pub. By the driver's account, the weather was poor and daylight was already fading. And it's his memory of that final moment that ended up becoming the defining image of the whole case. Ruth got out, but she didn't walk off the way you'd expect. She just stayed where she was, standing there. The driver said that stuck with him, because most people are up and heading somewhere the moment they dropped off, not still rooted to the spot as you pull away. People have speculated and wondered that she could have been expecting to meet someone there and was looking around. None of that recalled information really proves that she was waiting for somebody though. It doesn't really prove anything, or that she was even about to head off into the surrounding ground. What it leaves us with is the hard part, which is that the last known person publicly to have seen Ruth couldn't say where she went next, so the trail really stops right there on Box Hill. It is important to say too that that memory ended up having a lot of weight. I'd imagine because it's the last one. Though hindsight can do that, especially since it was remembered as being something a little out of the ordinary. A pause that might not have meant anything at the time could look loaded with meaning years later. She might have been gathering herself, checking where she was, or just waiting for the taxi to be out of sight before she moved away. We genuinely don't know, and that's really the whole of the physical trail. Whatever happened after that point remains completely unknown. One thing that adds a little to it is that Ruth had reportedly been to Box Hill before, sometimes after school. That at least makes it less likely that she'd just gone to a random place, though it still doesn't explain why she went there on this particular day. So, back to the Monday evening. When Ruth didn't come home, her family found out that she'd never been to school in the first place, and they contacted the police. Ian and Karen later said Surrey police had dogs out and a helicopter fitted with heat detecting kit up over the hill that very first night. And whatever people have come to think about this case since, the initial response the family described was genuinely quick and serious. On the 29th of November, 2 days after she disappeared, the flowers turned up exactly as she'd instructed, with no card and handed to Karen. Then, on the 1st of December, 4 days in, something turned up that the Times reported later that month, which was the 29th of December 1995. Officers searching the higher ground at the old quarry at Betchworth are said to have come across a handful of handwritten notes tucked beneath a bush. Between them, they apparently read as goodbyes to the people closest to her. What any of them actually said has never been made public. There is a caveat here though. While the Times is generally considered reputable, Surrey police have never, at any point in 30 years, publicly confirmed that any of that was found. The entire thing rests on that one newspaper report from 1995, and it's never been absolutely established whether those notes, if they existed, were written and placed there on the day that she disappeared, or at some earlier point. The silence from Surrey police doesn't necessarily mean that the report is wrong though. There are some pretty ordinary reasons a police force might sit on a detail like this, regardless of whether it's true. UK police and the press both tend to work under fairly strict conventions around confirming or detailing situations in which a person might have purposefully wanted to go from this world forever, largely because of the risk of influencing anyone else going through something similar. On top of that, if those notes were there, they'd have been deeply personal messages to people who are still here today, and there's a fairly obvious argument for never putting that out into the world. None of that confirms or refutes the notes either way. You'd have to imagine that the Times wouldn't report something like that if there wasn't something to it, though of course that leans on the reliability of their source, not just the paper itself. Either way, the very next day, the 2nd of December, the search got a great deal bigger. Something like 60 volunteers turned out for it, a mix of locals, school friends, people she'd worked with, and National Trust wardens with a helicopter up again overhead, and dogs trained to follow a scent, and also cameras that picked up body heat. This time, the effort was thrown at the quarry end of the hill, right around where these notes had supposedly been found. 60 people, a lot of whom either knew Ruth or knew that land well, combing that exact spot. The quarry itself got gone over in detail by a trained rescue team, working alongside the men who actually worked it day to day and knew every corner of it. One thing I've noticed about field searches like this is that some people tend to read them backwards once they've settled on a hypothesis already. If nothing turns up, one person takes that as proof she got away cleanly. Somebody else takes the same fact as proof the search missed something, and someone else decides it points to another person being involved. In reality, all a fruitless search tells us is that they didn't find Ruth, or anything that answered the case there and then. The weather, the ground cover, where people started looking, and the 1995 equipment all matter too. It doesn't necessarily prove that she couldn't have been there, and it doesn't prove that she must have left with somebody's help. It leaves you with that same frustrating gap either way. Though of course, given the effort of the search and the resources involved, I can see why people would think that if she was up there, that she'd have been found. And that doesn't seem to be an unreasonable take. The family later heard from school friends that Ruth sometimes stopped at Box Hill on her way home. They also found out that she'd hidden a recent school report, apparently because she was worried about her grades. Both things give you a bit more context, but neither tells you what happened. Worrying about school is about the most common thing in the world at that age, and stopping somewhere familiar after school can be completely ordinary. That's really the problem though. You can never truly know how a person is feeling inside their own mind. It's just not knowable to people on the outside. But there is something else sitting underneath all of this, and it became pretty central to how the whole case was later understood. In 2018, Martin Bright came back to Ruth's case in this Guardian article tied to this film, and that brought a part of Ruth's background into much sharper focus. Karen, as I've said, was Ruth's stepmother. Ruth's birth mother, Nesta, had passed away when Ruth and Jenny were both very young. The version the two girls grew up being told was that Nesta had passed away in an accident, which was a fall on the stairs. That was not what actually had happened. And I'll try to put this as gently as I can, though it's always difficult to get this point across on YouTube. The reality was, as far as I understand it, that Nesta had purposefully wanted to go from this world forever. Ruth only found this out a matter of weeks before she disappeared, and Catherine Mayer had said that it affected her deeply. Ruth's family said that she always knew Nesta had passed away, but didn't know the exact circumstances until shortly before she went missing. There's also a later account with more detail on this. In October of 1995, Ruth reportedly travelled up to London with Will to obtain the official records relating to her mother. If that's accurate, it explains how she found out. But the part that caught me off guard when reading about this isn't just that she did learn the truth, it's that she felt the need to go looking for an answer after years of living with a completely different story. So whatever hunch she may or may not have had at the time, it did turn out to lead her to the truth of the matter. Catherine has remembered Ruth as unsettled and confused in the aftermath, coming back to it again and again. In the 2018 film, she described Ruth as feeling her whole childhood had been built on untruths. And I can understand why that became such a central part of the story. It doesn't at all tell us what Ruth intended to do next, but it does help explain why this kind of news might have knocked the floor out from under her. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is where the case starts to split into two versions of the same girl. Some of her friends tend to remember somebody unhappy and struggling a bit. I'd imagine after having learned that information about Nesta, her father and stepmother have consistently pushed back on the idea that home was an unhappy place. And both of those things can genuinely be said in good faith. That comes back to the idea that you can't truly know what is happening inside someone's mind. I've seen numerous instances, as I'm sure most people have, where someone has been outwardly very happy and outgoing and such, but told a very different story on the inside. I don't want to turn her mother's passing into a ready-made explanation for Ruth's disappearance, because that would be far too easy and probably quite unfair. Finding something like that out could have brought anger, grief, confusion, or any number of things. But it's an enormous leap from "this was painful information" all the way to "and therefore this is what happened next," if you see what I'm saying. It's not possible to definitively make that leap on her behalf. She was 16. A person can be clever, well-liked, busy, and still be unhappy in parts of their life all at once. They can have plans for the future and feel completely overwhelmed by the present. They can talk about leaving without the first idea of where they'd actually go. None of that lets us put an exact motive in Ruth's head that she never got the chance to explain. The film did bring in more memories from the people who knew her. Will, who didn't want to be identified in it, described Ruth as troubled and unhappy at home. Roxy Birch remembered that Ruth didn't drive and, as far as she was aware, didn't have a passport. And Kay Blanard felt Ruth had made some kind of plan but couldn't say whether it was meant to be permanent or just temporary. So even the people closest to her were left holding questions rather than answers. There were a few other threads running through that same autumn too. Catherine was getting ready to move up to Sheffield, and Ruth had reportedly asked whether she might follow her up there later. Catherine's mother remembered Ruth staying over shortly before she disappeared, and saying very firmly that she couldn't face going back home, though she never explained why. And Ben Anderton has said Ruth stayed at his house for a time after running away at one point, again without ever giving a reason. The weekend just before Ruth went missing looked pretty ordinary from the outside. She worked her shift at the music shop, went for an Indian meal with Will and their friend Neil Phillipson, and over the weekend went to handbell practice, along to a youth group, and had supper at the Kennedys' house. The Indian meal took on a lot more weight afterwards, because Ruth insisted on paying for it herself, and reportedly told them that it was something to remember her by. At the time, I'd imagined that landed as a slightly odd, possibly a slightly theatrical thing for a teenager to come out with. Afterwards, of course, in hindsight, everything like that becomes more significant. The people around her can give us a much richer sense of who Ruth was, but none of them can really answer for what she had planned. There were later sightings, although I should stress, none of them have ever been confirmed. In the weeks after Ruth disappeared, various people in the Dorking area told police they thought they'd seen her, and one report involved a girl carrying a navy suitcase on Reigate Road. Others cropped up much further afield, including as far away as Canada, and a 2008 appeal even mentioned a possible lead on MySpace of all places. None of it ever gave the case an answer. The CCTV sighting though is the one that really sticks with people, and I understand why. Around the first anniversary of her disappearance, a young woman who was said to have looked a great deal like Ruth walked into a Dorking newsagent and asked for the local papers that were carrying coverage of the case. She was visibly upset. The shopkeeper reported it and kept the footage. Ruth's parents believed that the young woman was their daughter. Some of her friends who saw it did not, and it has never been settled either way. It could have been Ruth a year on, hoping to just get rid of a lot of the papers in that shop given the coverage. Or it could be somebody who simply happened to look a lot like her and happened to be upset about something else. I genuinely don't know what else you can do with that one, but it seems that it didn't lead the police anywhere. The police also put together a reconstruction of Ruth's final day. Her school friend Roxy Birch played her, retracing the florist, the library, and the taxi journey for the cameras. Roxy stayed involved in the later appeals too. The family and the people trying to help them kept Ruth's name out there however they could over the years. Her photograph went out on posters, and much later it featured in the 2012 Big Tweet for Missing Children. Ian wrote open letters directly to his daughter. One of the most widely published came in 2006, in which he wrote about the Christmas presents the family was still keeping for her, waiting for the day that she might come home. He wrote again on the 15th anniversary in 2010. After that, the family gradually stepped back from publicity altogether, which is something you see a lot with families of long-term missing people. The appeals cost you an enormous amount emotionally, and in many cases, they just stop producing anything. There has been some real criticism of the original investigation as well. Mark Williams Thomas, who a lot of people will now know as an investigative broadcaster, was assigned to support the family during the case. He later said he'd written an internal report questioning the search itself and the lack of early house-to-house inquiries, and that nobody ever formally acknowledged the points that he'd raised. In 2018, Bright and a retired officer, Liam Macaulay, came back to it in that film, which focused in large part on what the public had not been told, namely that Ruth had found out the truth about her mother's passing. Surrey Police's position was that the private family information of that kind should not have been made public. And honestly, I can see the argument on both sides. It still doesn't tell us the answer either way. So where does that leave us? There are a few ideas on the table, and Surrey Police themselves have laid out some of their own. Back in 2018, their Chief Superintendent of Public Protection, John Saville, set out 5 possibilities for what might have happened to Ruth. Broadly, they came down to an accident, someone taking her, a purposeful act, foul play, or that she'd chosen to slip away and start a new life somewhere else. The first idea, and the one that a lot of people find the most compelling, is that Ruth deliberately left to start a new life. And you can see why. Every single thing she did that Monday points at planning. She decided not to take the bus, she turned down a lift, she ordered flowers on a delay with no card, she spent 4 hours in a library, she went to a place she already knew, she had told friends repeatedly over weeks that she wanted to run away, and she had actually done it once before at Ben Anderton's house. Liam Macaulay, the retired detective who looked back over the case, put it that she was, in his words, dressed to get into another car, rather than to walk anywhere, and that a third party may have helped her. And the friends who knew her best are consistent that she talked about leaving, not about ending things forever. The problem with it is the 30 years. She was 16. She was still very young when all of this started. Roxy, who played her in the reconstruction, has made the point directly that Ruth couldn't drive and had no passport, which shuts down an awful lot of options straight away. Her only real means was that weekend shop job, and not much beyond it. There has never been a bank withdrawal, never a confirmed contact, and never a verified sighting. Staying hidden that completely at that age, with those resources, in a country this size for 3 decades, is genuinely an enormous ask. Not impossible, of course, but very difficult. The second idea is that Ruth wanted to go from this world forever, on or near Box Hill. What would support that is the reported notes near Betchworth Quarry, if they are actually confirmed as having been found. Also, perhaps the timing relative to what she'd just found out about her mother could be significant, which would coincide with Catherine's description of her becoming fixated on it. What works against it is the same thing that works against most of this case, which is that nothing was ever found. And this is where the location really matters. Box Hill is not remote wilderness in any sense. It's a National Trust site on the edge of the London commuter belt. It is walked constantly. It was searched over 1,000 acres within days by dogs and thermal imaging in a helicopter, and then searched again by 60 people who knew the ground well, concentrated on the exact spot where the notes were reportedly found. And in 30 years of walkers, dog walkers, cyclists, and wardens going over that hillside since, nothing has ever turned up. Williams Thomas, who was inside the investigation at the time, has stated that the extensive searches across Box Hill produced no evidence to suggest that she had done that, nor did it suggest any immediate involvement by another person. Speaking of which, the third idea is foul play, but in the 3 decades since, there has never been a named suspect, never an arrest, and no individual has ever been publicly linked to this by the police. The person best placed to speak to the early investigation, Williams Thomas, doesn't think that she was taken by a stranger. From his own experience, he said he'd narrow it to one of 2 things: that she went up there to meet someone and moved on from there afterwards, or that she went up there and one way or another didn't come back down, meaning, I'd assume, still being there on Box Hill waiting to be found. The fourth idea is that an accident took place, which is kept on the list of possibilities. Everything about that day was directed. She wasn't lost, she wasn't caught out, she was where she meant to go. The most recent word on it came around the 30-year mark. In February of 2025, Surrey Live reported the force's current position, and it was much as it had always been. It's still an open missing person inquiry. They're still keeping an open mind about what became of her, and as things stand, there is nothing that tips them towards any single explanation over the rest. The case gets looked at again on a regular basis as far as I can tell, filed under the name Operation Scholar. Nobody has ever been arrested, and nobody has ever been publicly named. 30 years on, the whole thing still comes back to a taxi driver's rearview mirror on a wet evening in November. Ruth, who had just found out something terrible about her mother, who had spent the day doing quiet, careful, organised things, standing completely still on a bridleway waiting for the taxi to go. Though waiting for what exactly is the question nobody has ever been able to answer since. If you have any information that could help to locate Ruth Wilson, please do contact Surrey Police or the charity Missing People. Links are in the description. That about brings us to the end of this. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, look after each other, and peace.